Have you ever watched a horror movie and wondered what dark corner of the human imagination could conjure such monsters? What if I told you that some of the most iconic villains in cinema, Norman Bates, Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, were not born in a writer's mind, but were inspired by the real-life actions of one quiet, unassuming man from the isolated farmlands of Wisconsin? This is the story of Gein, the man whose quiet madness became the blueprint for a generation of cinematic nightmares, proving that reality can be infinitely more terrifying than fiction. Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the mid-20th century, was the picture of rural American tranquility. It was a small, isolated town where everyone knew each other, a place of quiet farms, dense woods, and a community built on trust. But on the outskirts of this idyllic town, set back from the main road, was the Gein farm. It was a place of decay and isolation, a 160-acre prison ruled by a matriarch whose influence would extend far beyond the grave, casting a long, dark shadow that would eventually consume her son and horrify the entire nation. Edward Theodore Gein was born into this isolation in 1906. He was a quiet, shy boy, dominated by his fanatically religious mother, Augusta. Augusta Gein was a tyrant who preached a gospel of fire and brimstone, instilling in her two sons, Henry and Ed, a deep-seated fear of the outside world. She taught them that all other people, especially women, were instruments of the devil, vessels of sin and corruption. The farm was their only sanctuary, and her word was their only law. She was building a cage of piety and paranoia around her youngest, most devoted son. The Gein household was a place devoid of warmth or affection. Ed's father was a meek, alcoholic man whom Augusta openly despised, and he died of heart failure in 1940, leaving Augusta's control over her sons absolute. Ed and his older brother Henry worked the farm, but Ed rarely left his mother's side. He was his mother's boy, a socially awkward and effeminate man-child who saw the world through her twisted, fearful eyes. His only relationship was with this domineering woman who simultaneously suffocated him and was the entire center of his universe. In 1944, a mysterious fire broke out on the Gein property. While fighting the blaze, the brothers became separated. After the fire was extinguished, Ed reported his brother Henry missing. When a search party was formed, Ed was able to lead them directly to Henry's body, which was lying face down, seemingly untouched by the fire, but with bruises on his head. At the time, the death was ruled an accident, a result of asphyxiation. In hindsight, many now believe this was Ed Gein's first unproven murder, a possible act of removing his brother as a rival for their mother's sole attention. With Henry gone, Ed had his mother all to himself for one final year. But in 1945, Augusta suffered a debilitating stroke and died, leaving Ed utterly and completely alone on the farm at the age of 39. The anchor of his world, the very source of his identity, was gone. The psychological cage his mother had built for him was now empty. And in that echoing silence, a profound and monstrous transformation began to take place. The quiet farm boy of Plainfield was about to become the architect of a house of horrors. After his mother's death, Jane's isolation became absolute. He boarded up the rooms his mother had used, including her upstairs bedroom and the downstairs parlor and living room, leaving them as pristine shrines to her memory, untouched by time. The rest of the farmhouse, however, descended into a squalid chaos. He let the farm go to ruin and survived on odd jobs and government subsidies. The townsfolk saw him as a harmless eccentric, a quiet man who kept to himself. They had no idea that behind the boarded windows, Ed was cultivating a new, horrific obsession. In his profound loneliness, Jane's fascination with his mother warped into a grotesque, new purpose. He became consumed by a desire to, in his own mind, resurrect her. He began reading anatomy books, lurid pulp horror novels, and accounts of Nazi medical experiments. His nights were spent in a state of morbid study. His grief and twisted devotion led him to a horrifying conclusion. If he could not bring his mother back, perhaps he could become her. To do that, he needed raw materials, and he knew just where to find them. At Gein began his nocturnal activities shortly after his mother's death. He started visiting the local cemeteries under the cover of darkness with his neighbor, a mentally challenged man named Gus. He began to exhume the graves of recently deceased middle-aged women who he thought resembled his mother. He would load the bodies into his truck and take them back to the farm. According to Jane, Gus was unaware of the true nature of their late-night digging. This was the beginning of his collection, the first step in creating his macabre workshop. Back at the farmhouse, in the filth and the gloom, Jane began his gruesome work. He started to dissect the bodies he had stolen. Driven by a morbid curiosity about the female anatomy his mother had taught him to fear and despise, he began to experiment, tanning the skin of his subjects to preserve them. He was not just a grave robber. He was becoming a craftsman. He was using the dead to create trophies and household items, transforming the bodies of other women into a grotesque parody of domestic life, all within the shadow of his mother's sealed-off rooms. For nearly a decade, Ed Jane's secret life went completely undetected. The disappearances of bodies from graves were either not noticed or not connected. To the people of Plainfield, he was just weird old Eddie, the man who would sometimes babysit their children and share strange, rambling stories about his travels to exotic lands. No one could have possibly conceived of the reality of what was happening. Just a few miles from their homes, the monster of Plainfield was hiding in plain sight, protected by his own reputation as a harmless eccentric. The first tremor of the horror to come was felt in 1954 with the disappearance of Mary Hogan, the boisterous, profane owner of a local tavern. She vanished from her bar one winter night, leaving behind only a pool of blood and a spent .32 caliber cartridge case. The investigation went nowhere, and her disappearance became another piece of unsettling local lore. Some of the men in town would joke with Gein, asking, "Have you seen Mary?" He would often respond with a chilling, unsettling smile and say she was at the farm right now. They all thought it was a joke. The encounter that finally brought the darkness into the light occurred on November 16, 1957. Bernice Worden, the 58-year-old owner of the Plainfield hardware store, vanished. Her son, Frank, who was also the town's deputy sheriff, entered the store to find the cash register missing and a trail of blood leading to the back door. The last receipt written in the store's ledger was for a gallon of antifreeze. The last customer of the day, as recalled by locals, had been Gein. Frank Worden remembered Gein had been in the store earlier that week, asking when Bernice would be alone. Suspicion immediately fell on the town recluse, Sheriff Art Schley, and Deputy Frank. Worden drove out to the dilapidated Gein farm as night fell. The property was eerily silent, the house dark and foreboding. Gein himself was not there. He was at a neighbor's house for dinner. The officers located him and took him into custody, while another group of officers was dispatched to the farm with a search warrant. They had no idea they were about to step out of the quiet Wisconsin night and into the heart of a real-life horror film. The confrontation with evil began when Sheriff Schley and another officer forced their way into a shed attached to Gein's kitchen. The place was dark and freezing cold. Using their flashlights, they began to scan the cluttered space. The beam of light fell upon an object hanging from the rafters. At first, they thought it was a freshly dressed deer, as it was hunting season. But as their eyes adjusted, a wave of revulsion and horror washed over them. It was not a deer. It was the naked, decapitated body of Bernice Worden, hanging upside down. The true peak of the horror was inside the house itself, as more officers arrived and began a systematic search. The sheer, unimaginable depravity of Gein's world was revealed. The house was a garbage-filled labyrinth of filth and decay. But scattered amongst the squalor were his creations. They found bowls made from the tops of human skulls. They found chairs that had been upholstered with human skin. The discoveries grew more and more grotesque with every room they entered. A catalog of horrors that defied all reason. The list of macabre artifacts discovered in what the press would soon dub the House of Horrors was staggering. They found a lampshade made from a human face, leggings crafted from the skin of human legs, and a corset made from a female torso. They found a belt made of human nipples, the faces of 9 women preserved and mounted on the wall like hunting trophies, and a box containing 9 salted vulvas. They also found Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag. The quiet farm boy had decorated his home with the dead. The scene was so profoundly disturbing that one of the officers became physically ill, and another slammed his head against a wall in disbelief. Unable to process what he was seeing, amidst this charnel house, they found the sealed-off rooms of Augusta Jane. In stark contrast to the rest of the home, these rooms were immaculate, clean, and perfectly preserved, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment. This shrine to his mother stood at the heart of the filth, a testament to the obsession that had fueled this decade of madness. The aftermath of the discovery was immediate and sensational. At Gein, under interrogation, was calm and cooperative, if strangely detached. He admitted to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. He calmly explained his grave-robbing expeditions, detailing how he created his gruesome collection. He insisted he never had sexual relations with the bodies, claiming he would enter a daze and not remember the specifics of what he did. His confession was a chilling, matter-of-fact account of acts so monstrous they seemed to belong to a different reality. Gein was initially found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia. He was a model patient, quiet and polite, never causing any trouble. For 10 years, he lived in the institution, while the world outside tried to grapple with his crimes. His story became a media sensation, a tale of Gothic horror that had sprung to life in the heart of America's Dairyland. The town of Plainfield was forever scarred by the revelations. The community was consumed by shame, guilt, and horror. How could they not have known? The Gein farmhouse, the site of such unspeakable acts, became a macabre tourist attraction. In 1958, the house mysteriously burned to the ground, an act widely believed to be arson committed by locals desperate to erase the physical stain of Gein's legacy from their town. His remaining possessions, including the car he used to transport bodies, were sold at public auction. A decade later, in 1968, Gein was finally deemed sane enough to stand trial. The trial was a short affair. He was found guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden, but because he was also found to be legally insane at the time of the crime, he was sent back to the mental institution. He would spend the rest of his life there, a quiet, unassuming old man who had once been the most notorious man in America. He died of respiratory failure in 1984 and was buried in an unmarked grave in the Plainfield Cemetery, alongside his family and some of his unknown victims. The lingering dread of Ed Gein's story, however, does not end with his death. His real legacy began when a writer named Robert Bloch living just 35 miles from Plainfield, heard the news reports. He was fascinated by the idea of a reclusive, seemingly gentle man who was so devoted to his dead mother that he kept her room as a shrine while committing atrocities. This idea became the seed for his 1959 novel, Psycho, and its iconic character, Norman Bates, the soft-spoken motel manager with a deadly mother complex. Bloch's novel was famously adapted into a film by Alfred Hitchcock in 1960, and Norman Bates became a household name. The connection to Gein was undeniable. The isolated rural setting, the overbearing dead mother whose personality the son assumes, the shocking violence hidden behind a quiet demeanor. Hitchcock brought a version of Ed Gein's psychology into the mainstream, terrifying audiences with a monster who could be their quiet, polite neighbor. The horror was no longer in a castle, but right next door. The second ghost of Ed Gein to haunt cinema appeared in 1974. Director Tobe Hooper, inspired by the Gein case and the idea of a killer who used human remains to create furniture and masks, created the Texas Chain Saw Massacre. The film's villain, Leatherface, who wears masks made from the skin of his victims, is a direct echo of Gein's ghoulish craftsmanship. The film's depiction of a dilapidated farmhouse filled with furniture made of bone and skin is a direct lift from the real-life horrors discovered in Plainfield. The third, and perhaps most chilling cinematic echo of Gein's crimes, is found in the 1991 film The Silence of the Lambs. The character of James Gum, also known as Buffalo Bill, is a serial killer who murders women in order to skin them, hoping to create a woman's suit for himself. This desire to transform into a woman by literally wearing their skin is a direct reflection of Ed Gein's own confessed desire to become his mother, to crawl into her skin. These three characters, Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, form a trinity of modern horror, and they all owe their existence to the quiet madness of one man. Gein's real-life crimes were so bizarre, so far beyond the pale of normal human behavior, that they provided a fertile ground for storytellers. His story contained the archetypal elements of horror: a creepy, isolated house, a disturbed relationship with a parent, a hidden cellar of secrets, and the desecration of the human body. The case of Ed Gein forced America to confront a new kind of evil. He was not a gangster or a professional killer. He was a product of extreme isolation and profound psychological abuse. He blurred the lines between the mad and the bad, a pitiable and lonely man who committed monstrous acts. His story is a chilling exploration of what can happen when a human mind is allowed to decay in solitude, completely untethered from reality and morality. The horror of Ed Gein is not just in what he did, but in how he did it. He was a handyman, a craftsman of the macabre. He took the ultimate taboo the desecration of the dead, and turned it into a domestic project. The idea of transforming a human being into an object, a piece of furniture, or an item of clothing is a uniquely terrifying concept. And it's a horror that Gein brought from the darkest recesses of the mind into the real world. Even today, the name Ed Gein carries a palpable chill. His crimes have become a part of American folklore, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can fester in quiet places. The farmhouse is gone, and Gein himself is long dead, but his influence is immortal. He lives on in the flickering images on our movie screens, in the villains that have given us nightmares for decades. He is the ghost in the machine of modern horror. So the next time you watch a classic horror film, when you feel that familiar chill as the quiet, unassuming villain reveals his true nature, remember the man from Plainfield. Remember that the terrifying fiction you are watching is a diluted version of a far more disturbing reality. And ask yourself, what is more terrifying? The monster on the screen, or the knowledge that the man who inspired him was real, living and breathing, and building his house of horrors in a quiet town, just like yours?